I would like to officially welcome Jay, who will be sharing with us updates in composite models. I'm so happy again that you finally made it to one of my groups in South Florida, virtually this time again. And thank you so much for being here. I will let you introduce yourself for those who don't know you. And whenever you're ready, you may share your screen.
Okay. Hi all, I'm Jay or Jeroen, as
I didn't want to try to pronounce it.
That's fine. I blame my interesting first name on the lack of vision on the side of my parents. So they probably never imagined I would live in a country that didn't speak Dutch. So I'm originally Dutch. I moved to the US in December 2018. And I kind of renamed myself because I don't want to, I don't want to ask and force people to try to pronounce my name all the time. So Jay works perfectly fine. Jeroen, I'll respond to that as well. Jerry, if you call me Jerry, you might have to say it 2 or 3 times before I respond. So, just those are kind of the options to choose from. If you want to try say Jeroen properly, that's fine. Don't bother about my last name, actually. That's even harder. I work at Microsoft for as long as I remember. I started fresh out of university or college with Microsoft. That has been almost 13 years ago now. So I have the 5-year and the 10-year crystal. So yeah, now 2 years in the product team. I joined Power BI in April of this year. And yeah, it feels like coming home. It's great. Power BI is a great team to work in. Power BI is a very cool tool to work on. And in that space, I own the data modeling and DAX space. So I'm very happy to see that you have a meetup on DAX because, DAX is not easy. And I know, and we need to do better. And we need to make sure that DAX is usable for more people. So, you can expect some news there. We're thinking about it, or I'm thinking about it, on how we can improve that situation as well. So yeah, that's basically me. On the internet, you might find me under my normal name or under my alias, which is Dutch Data Dude. That's also my blog, and you'll find me on YouTube like that and those kind of things. So with that, in this session, I want to cover what is coming for composite models. We'll talk about a little bit about what composite models are today, what they do, where we're taking it next, and why that matters to you. And this is an open session. I do have slides, but if you have specific questions you want me to answer, or complaints, or you want to rant about something, go ahead. Right, I'm here to listen. I'm here to learn as well. I can definitely fast forward through my slides, but then I won't learn anything new today. So please also jump in and let me know in the chat or whatever if there's something that I need to discuss, or something you're worried about, or something you want to know. Okay, good. I guess you guys all see my screen, or not?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you for confirming that. So let's go to the first slide, or the first actual slide, which is something I'm gonna skip mostly because it's my mandatory marketing-driven slide about what Power BI is, and I kind of assume you all know what Power BI is, right? So the marketing spiel is we try to drive a data culture with Power BI for everyone and every decision. So everyone at any level in any organization can use Power BI to their extent in their situation to drive any decision, hopefully a good decision. So that's what we're trying to do with Power BI. Now, the topic today is composite models. And composite models are a bit weird because honestly, they already exist, but it's also something you tend to forget they exist, actually, because a composite model is something, is a model in Power BI when you take one data source and you add something, which is something you can do today, right? You can connect to, let's say, SQL Server, and then you can take an Excel sheet and you say, I've got a spreadsheet for that. No, you don't have to say that, but you take SQL, you take your Excel sheet, you mesh them up, and that's your composite model, right? So everything is already there. But we never call it a composite model. We don't. We never do that. You just treat it as normal that will work in Power BI. Well, there are a couple situations where composite models don't work that way. And that's where we're going to talk about today and what we're going to do about that. Okay? But first, before we do that, the way I like to think about a composite model is actually in a little story. And I'll tell you the story here. And it's a tale of two kingdoms. It's a tale of two competing, but also cooperating kingdoms. They cannot live without each other, but they cannot really stand each other. And those two kingdoms are kind of representative for two big groups in any organization. So let's walk through the story real quick, and then we get back to like the core of the technology we want to talk about here. Okay, so imagine you're working as a business analyst for the kingdom of Venezuela, right? You're working there. Your job is to use Power BI, and your job is to create awesome reports and models and views that drive great decisions for the king of Venezuela or the queen of Venezuela, right? So you mash up everything. You take your Excel sheet, you take a CSV, you take a SQL database, you wrestle it into something, you push it together, and out comes magic. Life is good, right? Everything is great. Everything works. Awesome. But your level of honor, your level of knowledge brings you to the table with the king. And the queen or the king says, you know what? I work with people from another country as well. We do a lot of trade with another neighbor country. And I need you to step in and help me analyze that trade and understand what is going on between our two countries. Can you do that? And of course, you will say, yes, I'm the Power BI king. I can do whatever you want, right? I can wrestle any data into any shape that you want it to be in, so you can make the right decisions. So great, you go. And you cross the border, and you cross the border into Itistan. And in Itistan, things work slightly different. First of all, they have a different currency and a different measurement system. They work in Celsius, not in Fahrenheit, as we talked about at the beginning of this meeting. But things are slightly different organized from where you're from in Venezuela. They store data differently. They report on it differently. It comes from like very archaic IT systems. At least in your eyes, it's very archaic and very tightly controlled. The rules on what you can do with data is completely different. They have strict regulations that stop you from downloading data from a database and just taking it with you in an Excel sheet or on a USB drive and just, start playing with it like you are used to do in Venezuela. And they don't want you to do that because they are afraid they lose track of this data. They are afraid the data starts living on its own, and they don't know anymore who owns the data and why the decision was made to do A, B, or C based on which data when, by whom. So all of that is different for you. And the stakes are higher because the data might be more sensitive to them. So now suddenly it dawns on you that combining this data from Venezuela with this, comparing this to Itistan's data and trying to mesh that together is becoming impossible. It is stored in a weird format that you've never seen before. It is stored in something they call analysis services. That's not the Excel, CSV, Access world you used to, or the SQL world you've been using, and you cannot combine those two. So now what? What do you do? You're stuck. You're stuck in these two lands between Venezuela and IT, and there's no way for you to work your magic. And now here is where we come in, because we need to think about what we can do from the Power BI team to solve this. Okay, so with that, let's go back to the composite models. So I'll first talk about what composite models are today, what they do, and then I'll explain where they have some shortcomings. And then we'll talk about what we're going to do about those shortcomings. Okay? So a composite model, again, in Power BI Desktop, whenever you take data from one source and you add data from another source to that, we actually call that a composite model because in essence, it's made out of two parts that play together, a composite. It doesn't matter where the data came from. It doesn't really matter if you imported the data into Power BI Desktop or if you just made a live connection to it or a direct query connection. It doesn't matter. Any situations where you take data from source 1, add data from source 2, mesh them together by, for example, building a relationship, that's where you have a composite model. And it's great to have that because, well, if you combine 1 and 1, you get 3, right? It's better than just 1 and 1. It's not 2. There's more value in adding 2 things together. The business insights come from when you take different aspects and combine them together to get more value. So that's essentially what a composite model is. You've been building this all your life in Power BI. All the time you work in Power BI, the most interesting situations are when you use a composite model. But there's limitations. If you connect to Power BI, use Power BI to connect to SAP HANA, SAP BW, SQL Server Analysis Services, Power BI datasets, or Azure Analysis Services. In any of those situations, if you connect to any of these sources, you will have seen that this magic of adding something else to the dataset is gone. If you connect to any of these 5, you will not be able to add more data to the report. The only thing you can do is you just visualize on these datasets. So you connect to your IT Stan Analysis Services database. And the only thing you can do with Power BI is you can create graphs on it, and charts, which are awesome, but you cannot extend it. You cannot add more data. You cannot do the mashup that you wanted, right? Like you can with an Excel sheet and a CSV, or with a SQL database that you imported or direct query did on it and an Excel, and you mesh it together. Something like that you cannot do if you use any of these sources. And that is a problem. Because it turns out that in many organizations, the IT department, which is obviously my little story, IT Stan, uses any of these. They store the massive amounts of data in SQL Server Analysis Services, in Azure Analysis Services, in Power BI datasets. And if the data is in there, it's impossible for a business user or for an analyst to use Power BI and mash it up with something else. Now, here's where we're going to change something, because we want you to be able to do that. We want to help you to mash up these sources together. We want Power BI to grow from a self-service tool to a full-blown enterprise BI and self-service platform. So regardless if you're a self-service BI user or you're building enterprise BI reports for the bigger organization, you should be able to just mash everything together and not have a second thought about it, like today with composite models. So our vision is to build a new tool or an improved version of Power BI where we'll introduce something we call composite models tomorrow. We haven't landed on what tomorrow means. The date is still not set in stone, so it's not actually tomorrow, it's somewhere in the future. But basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to solve the pain points that people have with composite models today. And we're going to change the way they work to enable more scenarios. So let's think about that for a second. Let's imagine you work in a big organization and you have an IT department and they created a data warehouse and all of the organization's data is stored in there. Their sales, their financial figures, everything is stored in there. Chances are, on top of that data warehouse, you have a semantic model. And we call that the enterprise semantic model. That's central here in this picture, the ESM for short. And in many situations, that's actually built in something called analysis services, which is just a semantic layer around the data warehouse. And we want to enable you to take that data, extend that data, and report on it. So we want to enable you to use Power BI Desktop to take data from the ESM, the Enterprise Semantic Model, add your Excel sheet, add anything you want to do, make changes to it even, and then report on that report and create visualizations and share it with your business group or director or whoever you work for. Now, taking the data from the ESM doesn't mean you go into IT with a USB drive and downloading the 10 terabytes of data into a CSV and wrenching it into Power BI, right? That's not the right way. We want to enable you to connect to the ESM, leave the data in the enterprise semantic model where it is, but then still allow you to extend and make those personalizations. And we'll go one step further. Because let's imagine you you work in an organization with me, right? So I created the enterprise, I created a report on the enterprise semantic model. I added an Excel sheet to it and I shared that together, and I'll explain to you how that will work. But I shared that out to you, and now you come in, you say, that's all great what Jay did. He took the data from the enterprise semantic model, great work. He added the Excel sheet, good work. But yeah, I'm missing something. There's like this SQL database that's really very valuable. And if I connect those three together, we get more value out of this report. So in essence, you will take my work and extend that again. So you get a chain of composite models where the first model was the enterprise semantic model, then the second was mine, where I added the Excel sheet, then you come in and you add whatever, the SQL Server database to it. So you get a chain of models depending on each other. And that's also something we're gonna enable in the near future. And essentially that's what this picture represents, is where you can get more and more models grown into your enterprise, hopefully each of them more specific to the end user example where we want to go, right? So for example, let's say you work in an organization that has subsidiaries across the globe. You work in Europe, and the IT department is in the US, right? So for the IT department, they formatted the dates as month, day, year, because that makes sense to an American brain. But to Europeans, it doesn't make any sense, right? We're not right now in 9/24/2020. There's no 24th month in my brain. The way I would write it is 24/9/2020, right? So your users in Europe will get confused by the fact that this format string is different from what they're used to. So in this new version of composite models, you could actually go in and say, you know what? For the people in Europe, I will override the format string to not be month, day, year, but day, month, year, right? That will make perfect sense to them. There's no change in the semantic model. Everybody else will still see month, day, year, but for them, it will be the right way around and they will be less confused. So those kind of things we call personalizations on the semantic model is something we're gonna enable as well. Okay, so just to summarize what is gonna happen. We're gonna remove the biggest roadblock that people have with using typical IT sources. Typical IT sources, we think about Azure Analysis Services, SQL Server Analysis Services, and Power BI datasets. The moment you connect to any of these three sources, you cannot do anything with composite models today. And we're going to change that, as I said. We're enabling you to extend those sources with anything you might have. So for example, you have a Power BI dataset, and then that dataset really needs an Excel sheet to be added to it to create more value. Well, you cannot do that today. If you take the dataset, you can only report on it and create charts. Great, but you cannot extend it. Now with this new version, you will be able to extend it and add the Excel sheet or add whatever you want to do. And that's not all. You can also choose to personalize the dataset. You can say, rename a column, hide a table, create a new measure, rename a measure, change a format string. So all of those things will be enabled. There will, however, be a couple of limitations. And those limitations will be that if you connect to SAP HANA, SAP BW, or SQL Server Analysis Services multidimensional mode, your situation will not change. So Composite Models updated version will not help you in this regard. So only if you use Azure Analysis Services, Power BI datasets, or SQL Server Analysis Services tabular mode, in those three situations, you will benefit from this updated version of Composite Models. In all of the other situations, SAP HANA, SAP BW, SQL Server Analysis Services, multidimensional, you cannot use Composite Models even after the updates have been released. Which doesn't mean that you cannot download data from SAP HANA or BW or SQL Server Analysis Services multidimensional and still extend it. But honestly, that's a kind of a scenario we don't see to happen very often, because those enterprise data sources are very large. So who really wants to download 10 terabytes of data into their Power BI desktop and then try to wrestle that into something that works? That's never going to happen, right? So honestly, people always use a live connection to SAP HANA or SAP BW or SQL Server Analysis Services multidimensional, where the data stays in those sources and you just query whatever you need. And that way your Power BI stays nice and small. It stays handleable. You can still handle it. And that's the way to work with them. So the restrictions that we had previously will go away partially, but not all of them will be lifted. And the question I get often at this point is, okay, it's great that you're going to change something. It's great that we can now use Azure Analysis Services to mash up data. It's great that we can now take a Power BI data set and mash up data with that. Awesome. It's great that you can do that with SQL Server Analysis Services tabular. But what about multidimensional? And what about SAP? Well, multidimensional is a source that has been around forever. It's a great tool. However, our investments are on SQL Server Analysis Services tabular. So we are not actively investing in multidimensional anymore. So basically our suggestion would be to consider moving to tabular. And I know there's functional differences between multidimensional and tabular, and we're trying to close that gap. But until that point, if you're stuck on multidimensional, you need to go import mode. Otherwise, you cannot use Composite Models. And with the SAP story, it's even easier. SAP connection to Power BI is something that is tricky, very tricky. Every day I deal with clients that have issues connecting to from Power BI to SAP, because as many different countries that are on this globe, so many configurations you can have for SAP as well. There's so many different variables here that change the situation that it's very hard for me to tell you how to connect to SAP correctly. I cannot guarantee it will work even. So honestly, the SAP connection is very hard and might not even work. So why would we invest in making that look nice and work with all the greatest features while some people cannot even connect to it to begin with? So we need to fix the foundation first before we build the great house on top of the foundation. So that's why this is not included. So SAP is out of scope, and SQL Server Analysis Services multidimensional is out of scope. If you use tabular, Power BI dataset, or Azure Analysis Services, you're good to go. Any questions so far? I don't see anything in the chat.
I don't see anything either.
So either it's completely boring or it's completely crystal clear. I don't know, any of the two.
We're focused.
I actually have a quick question for you. Mm-hmm. So is there I guess a best practice or recommendation of when you should consider doing direct query versus imports versus, there's different modes you can go into. So is there a recommendation on which one you should use and when?
So, the answer as always is it depends, right? It depends on the data volume. That's number one. So for example, if you have a 500 megabyte analysis services tabular model, you should easily be able to import that into Power BI. That should not be a problem. However, sometimes there's situations where you don't want that, or you're not allowed to do that because somebody else controls that data source. It might be an IT control and you cannot take the data out of it. You are only allowed to read it, right? And that's where you have to use direct query. The great thing about direct query is that the data stays where it is. All of the things, for example, row level security, which dictates what part of the data you can actually see, will still apply. And that's great because you just get the data set you're allowed to have, and the data set stays where it is. So the only thing that you do from Power BI is you just query the direct query source. The performance is great because the only thing it does, it just points to the data source, and the data source will have to handle all the querying. And that being a database, normally that should work just fine. So strict, like clear guidelines I cannot give you, but normally it's data size, rules, and agreements that you have, and the RLS situation, right? So if there's RLS on the data source, there's really no other way for you to connect to it than through live/direct query mode. Now, going live of direct query has limitations. One of them we just talked about, and there's also a couple of limitations with that in DAX. So the DAX query language has a couple of limitations when you work with a direct query source, most notably with the related functions. Those are functions that need access to a little bit more of the data and metadata of the original source to actually work correctly and performant. So that's why they don't work as well as they do with an import model. So unfortunately, I cannot give you a clear-cut answer, but my approach to it is whenever I see a Power BI data set or Azure Analysis Services or SQL Server Analysis Services, I always go live or direct query mode, unless I really need to download it all for whatever weird reason.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jay.
Sure. Let's see. There's a question. I'm not sure if I missed it, but when is this new Power BI version available? Well, there is already a Power BI version just available, like Cecilia just posted it, which is the blog post that I wrote yesterday, or well, I wrote it a couple of days ago. Not yesterday, the day before yesterday even. Man, I get lost in days these days. I don't know which day it is. Thursday? Yes, it's Thursday today. Right? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. At least here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, but so that is the new version. But this version that we talk about here, the features that we talk about here, the Composite Models updated version is not going to be in there. So you won't be able to find it. We actually are able, we currently are in what we call private preview mode with these features. And the next step after private preview is to come to a public preview, which means everybody can try it. Private preview means only people that we invite from the Microsoft side, let's say customers, big high-profile customers that have been asking for this, that we have a good relationship with. We invite them to test it. That's private preview. Depending on how that goes, we go to public preview relatively quickly or longer. Normally it takes a couple of weeks, but it might take a couple months even, depending on, if things break in private preview, I have to go back to the drawing board more times to fix it. And after public preview, we generally get a GA date, a generally available date, and that is where all the gates open and it's available in the tool without you having to do anything else. So public preview is the first moment you can probably touch this new version of Composite Models. And when we get to public preview, you will see an announcement in the blog, but you will also see this little checkbox in the Power BI desktop settings. You will probably see something called, I don't know, Composite Models, whatever we're going to call it. Marketing still has to figure out the name. Let's say Composite Models V2. I don't know. That's probably not going to be the name, but let's say it's that's the name. You will see that in the desktop settings as a preview function. You enable it, and that's how you get into the public preview. So that moment is close, but it's not there yet, right? As I said, we're currently in private preview. Give us a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, depending on how it goes, and then we get to public preview. So I don't know. Let's say maybe we can give some people a Christmas present. That would be great, right? Maybe something like that, around those lines. But don't, don't quote me on it. We'll see. I cannot tell you when it will be exactly, but we're doing our best to get it into your hands as quickly as possible, of course. Okay, so let's look into a little bit of a demo here on how this will work, because slides are great, but now let's talk about how it actually will work and show you that it works. So here it is, a regular Power BI environment, right? We have a sales report, and what I did here is I connected to our Azure Analysis Services instance, right? So here's a sales data model. I think it's based on AdventureWorks. And it's just sitting in Analysis Services. So this is a live connection to Analysis Services. The data is still in Analysis Services, and the only thing that I did is connect to it, and I build a visual on top of it that I can just, build some tables and some cards, and things are good, right? Now, you might have noticed in a little earlier release, I think it was in June already, that if you are connected to a live data source, you suddenly can see the data model. Before June, you couldn't see the data model. Before June, the only thing you would get if you were connected live to a data source is the reporting view, this view. You wouldn't see the data model at all. And the reason we built this, or the reason we enabled this, is because it's a little step towards composite models, because we need this. Because how else are you gonna add more data? And how else are you gonna be able to relate these data sources together and mash them up and create more value if you don't have the relationship diagram, if you don't know what the data model looks like? So that's why we enabled that. So today, this is what you have. This is already there. You'll see the data model from the live connected source. So this is my Azure Analysis Services environment. You'll see the data model. You cannot do anything with it. It's just there for informational purposes. Now you know how the relationships go, and if they're bidirectional, if they're one-to-one, many-to-many, one-to-many, all of that good stuff you can now see. Great. So the today version would stop here. But in the new version that we will get into your hands as soon as possible, you can still keep building. Because now I can just click on Get Data right here on the screen, right here, and I can say, you know what? I'm just going to connect to a Power BI data set that is in PowerBI.com. And that's our finance model. And I'm just going to connect to that. This is something you cannot do today. And if I create that connection, that's my second live connection in this data source, in this data set, right? The first one was the sales model. That was a live connection to Azure Analysis Services. The second one, the finance model, is a Power BI data set, which is by default a live connection. So 2 live connections. And now what happens is I end up with what we call, and we haven't landed on the name yet, but let's call them islands for now. We now have 2 islands in this data model. One is the red one, the one that we started out with, the sales model. And the green one, which just came in, that's the finance model from PowerBI.com, right? 2 separate islands at the moment. But we're not done. Because what use is it if you can just have 2 separate islands? Why do they need to be separate? What's the value in adding those 2 in one report? Well, the value is 0, I would say. So we can build relationships between the 2. We can just say, you know what? That date table that is in the sales model, it's actually also used in the finance model. It's the same one. So why should I have 2? Why can I not just relate them? And the same for the customer table. The customer table is in the sales model. Finance also talks about customers, but doesn't track the customers in their model. But just by relating them together, because there's a customer key on the finance metrics table, I can now use the customer table from the sales model and take any metric from the financial metrics and cross-join, or cross-align them with anything from the customer. And we don't have to stop here. We can go a little bit further than that. What about creating a measure? Well, we can. So here I can calculate a margin which is the sales, which comes from the sales schema, the sales island, and I take the royalty and the volume discount from the finance island, and I divide them, right? I subtract and divide, and that's how I get a margin, or I think this is even a margin percentage, right? So as you can see, for creating a relationship or creating a measure, it doesn't really matter if it's two islands. You can just handle them as if they were just one and the same from the one and the same source, or if they were just two import sources that you used before. And you might think, okay, this is great, but can I also use it in the same visual? Well, yes, you can. Who cares? It's just a measure. So now we have the sales and the date from the one model, and the margin, that was a measure that we defined that actually combined data from the two islands into one visual. Are we done? No, because there's no end here. We can keep going. Let's add another source. Why not? We can import weather data from Excel and relate it. There's no stopping you. There is no limitation here unless your laptop breaks. Right? If you have so many data sources loaded into Power BI that you run out of RAM locally here on your laptop, yes, that's the moment it starts breaking. But before you reach that point, we don't have any limitations. I have seen a colleague building a composite model with 84 connections to it. 84 data sets, 84 islands all across the board. And it's crazy because it gets very confusing, right? Imagine having 84 islands, each with tables and columns and relationships. And so that's why we also need to rethink a little bit what the data model view actually looks like. So one of the things that we're considering is doing colors, as we see here, to use colors to identify different islands. But we're also thinking, for example, if I zoom out in the data model, should at some point maybe just the details about what is in an island just disappear, and we should just see, in this case, two big islands and one small one, right? One island called sales, one island called finance, and the other one called weather data, right? I zoom out to a high level. I don't want to see all the details, but I can still see how they are related. So that's essentially what we're trying to think about. So let's see. There's a bunch of questions here. I think there's also lots of happiness in the chat. I can see that.
A lot of excitement.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. Fernando asks, does that increase the size of the PBX file? That's a good question. So the answer is no, if you go into live connection mode, right? The moment you import data, yes, the size of your PBX will increase because it has to store all of the data that you imported. So this blue box, let's just say that's an Excel sheet, whatever it's in there, let's call it 10 megabytes, that has been added to my PBX. So that will blow up my PBX. However, the addition of this finance model, which could be a couple of terabytes, is very small. Yes, of course, we need to store a little bit about this model because we store a little bit of the metadata, right? We store, for example, the table names and column names. We store format strings. We store data types. We store relationships. All of that we store. So yes, there will be a little bit of an increase in the size, but it won't be in the same scale as the total amount of data that might be in this finance model, right? So if you have a 10 terabyte finance model, you might see 5 megabytes uptake in the size of your PBX, which is peanuts compared to what it could have been, right? And why do we, by the way, store this local metadata? Is because we allow you to go in and say, you know what, that customer number is really something I don't want to see. Or as I gave the example about the dates is not formatted the right way for my audience. And you can go in and change that format string or that settings or rename the column or hide the column, add a new measure, and all of that you do here in Power BI. You don't do that in the semantic model because we don't want you to touch that, right? You might not even have write access to the semantic model, which is normally a good thing. So that might be owned by somebody else, but you can make the changes locally. That's why we need the metadata in Power BI. Let's see. Finally, I've been waiting for this feature. Yes, I've been waiting for this one as well for 4 years. Fernando kind of, oh, you answered your own question right there. Okay, I didn't read that far yet. Are they color coded? Well, that's one of the options that we're thinking about. We need a way to help people understand which island they are in. So color coding is one of the options, but color also comes with a downside. Some people might not be able to distinguish red and green. So, you know, what should we do? But our designers will do something about that. Just release it. Yeah. We'll get there. How will it work with the relationship between the islands? Any special requirements? So relationships between islands will be the same, will be treated the same by the engine as any many-to-many relationship today. And I should rephrase that a little bit more specific even. In this situation, forget about the blue box for a second. I have a red island and a green island. Both of them are live connections. That means the data is not stored in Power BI. Data is where it is. The only thing Power BI knows is the metadata about the source and how to get to the data. Okay? If I create a relationship between the red and the green island, like I did with date and customer here, that relationship is a relationship between two direct query sources, between two sources that don't store the data in Power BI. That relationship is a limited relationship, as we call it. We used to call it weak, but we've renamed it to limited. So please adopt that new name. And that's the same, by the way, as many-to-many relationships today in any data model are also limited. And with limited relationships, a couple of things come at a price. And one of them is that DAX behaves slightly different. For example, related. The related function works slightly different. That's all documented. It's not a long list. It's a couple of lists, like 3 or 4 things that you need to be aware of. If you start using this, you can still create the relationship. It's just dragging and dropping like you're used to. However, that relationship will be limited. We'll show you it's limited. And then you can learn more and see what kind of things are the limitations here. So there's nothing special about the relationships. They're just limited. Let's see. So no special requirements or whatever. How much RAM is recommended? As much as you can get. Yeah, I mean, I once did a test with a machine with 60 terabytes of RAM, and Power BI still worked, and it was great, and it was able to handle petabytes and petabytes of data because it just stores it all in the RAM and everything. So as much RAM as you can get, the better it is. But honestly, 8 gigs, 16 gigs should be fine for this, because if you just do a live connection, there's not a lot of things that we have to do in the Power BI side, right? We're only storing this minimal amount of information about the connection. Okay, are we interested in understanding a little bit more of how this works under the covers? This is what you get when you talk to the product group. You get to dive into the engine a little bit. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. If I start with a live connection, Power BI has no data model, because the only thing it does, it just says, oh, you know, you spoke to Azure Analysis Services, the data is there, I know how to query it, I'll just allow you to build some graphs and you're good. So what will happen is the moment you want to make a change to a column, let's say you want to rename customer underscore ID to customer identifier to make it look nicer. If you want to rename that, the moment you do that rename, we will pull the metadata about the remote model into Power BI. And that is where we will apply the change. So we'll do that. We call it an upgrade from a live connect to a composite model, because we need that metadata to be stored, because we should keep the changes somewhere. We need to track them somewhere. We cannot track them in air. We need to store them somewhere. So that's what's going to happen under the covers. Now, depending on the size of your data model, this might be painless, but it might take a little bit, right? If your data model is very complex, if it's 500 tables with many relationships, calculations, whatever, it might take us a little bit of time to download all that metadata. We're not talking hours, we're talking seconds, but still, it might, Power BI might have to do a little bit of work. So we will probably prompt you to upgrade to a composite model to apply this renaming change that you just did. And we'll tell you it will take a little bit. And when you click OK, please upgrade, we'll go work a little bit. And you just have to wait for a couple of seconds, and then we'll be ready for you to continue working. So that's essentially what we're doing in the background. Now, to give you an example, here's a very simple example. We start with a live connected data source. That's the blue box in the middle. OK, I connect live to it. I build my report. I create visuals, and I think live is great. I publish the report. What we end up with is just a report on the Power BI service that points to the live cube, right? The live data source. So done, right? This is easy. This is the way it works today. Now let's think about this in the next situation. I connect to the same source, but instead of just going right to the charts and building graphs, no, I'm going to make a change. I'm going to change the format string on the date for European users. And that change needs to be applied to the local metadata. So at that point, when I want to make the change, Power BI will download the metadata from the blue box into its own data model in what we call a proxy to the blue box. And Power BI will persist the changes you made in that local data model. Then once you publish your report, what you will end up with is the new report and a new data set. The new data set doesn't contain any data. It just contains the metadata that you changed, all of the metadata and the changes you made in step number 2. And that data set will point and connect to the blue box. That's why we call it a proxy, like a proxy server or whatever, right? Now, if I do the same again, but I'm connecting live to the same source and I'm going to import some data, still Power BI will create a local data model. At step 1, it doesn't need one, but the moment you import something, it needs one because it needs to store the data somewhere. Now, when you publish this report, what you end up with is a report and a data set. The data set here has 2 connections, one to the blue cube, and the second one, it has a connection to the Excel sheet, and it stores the data from the Excel sheet because that was imported. The data from the blue cube is never imported. It was live. So hopefully this kind of helps picture what you want to end up with in the situation where you start using composite models in this way. Now, data flows, Fernando, data flows can be live connected. Yes, so you can treat them as a live connected source, but you could also import them, both of them, whatever you want to do. So data flows are definitely just a source. You can connect to them and treat them as if they were just a database or an Excel sheet. And normally what we see people do is use data flows in a live connection mode because you don't really know how much data is going to be in there. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so there's a couple of things. What about scheduled refresh with 2 different data sources? Good question. So scheduled refresh is only applicable, of course, if you have an import model, right? Otherwise, we just refresh the cache regularly. So you will be able to configure for each source what needs to happen. So if you have multiple sources, you will be able to say, okay, I'm gonna refresh the live connected source every 15 minutes and the imported every 8 hours. So I hope that answers the question. Now, at this point, you can probably imagine that there are situations in enterprises where this might become very challenging. Because let's say Cecilia created a composite model and I take her composite model and add an extra Excel sheet and publish that as well. It's very easy to create this chain because a composite model is just a Power BI data set. So I can just take her Power BI data set and build a composite model on top of it. And somebody else might build a composite model on that one and go and keep going and keep going. Before you know it, you lose track of how data flows through your organization and which data was used where. And that's where we need to do something. And luckily, we already have something for that. We call it the lineage view, right? So we start talking about the lineage view. So lineage view is already there in PowerBI.com. You might already have seen it. And it shows you where a data set gets their data, in which reports and dashboards are dependent on that data set. Now, there's one thing this thing doesn't do today, because simply that scenario doesn't exist. It doesn't show you how two data sets relate to each other. So here you see a mock-up of what it will look like, where sales is my enterprise semantic model. It takes data from some SQL server and it has two reports. And then my budget and sales is a composite model that's dependent on the sales model and has added an Excel sheet. And on budget and sales, there's also a report. Now you can imagine that there might be another data source depending on budget and sales that will be dependent on that one, which is like the third piece in the chain, right, if you will. I can also see not only the backward looking, like the upstream flow, but also who's dependent on me, right? So if I go impact analysis, select impact analysis on budget and sales, today you can already do that, but you won't see which data sources are dependent on you, which data sets. You will see that as well. So you will see the first dependent on your data source. So that's sales and budget Europe is dependent on budget and sales. So that's the chain. And in the future, we want to get to the point where you will be able to see the full chain, but that's something we have to redesign the diagram view a little bit for. But in the end, we want to paint the whole chain of how data flows through your enterprise. Data flows, it starts with data flows, for example, ends up being in a sales model, then budget and sales, then sales and budget Europe or whatever it is, and then maybe something else. Now, this chain is important because it helps you understand how data flows through your organization. But also, if I make a change to a data source, a composite model that somebody else is dependent on, I might break stuff, right? Let's say I own budget and sales and Cecilia owns budget and sales Europe. If I go in and publish a new version of my data model, budget and sales, and I rename something, or I change the data type of a column and I save it, I don't know what she did. She might be dependent on that one column, and I don't necessarily have to be aware of that. So what do? Well, the moment you republish an existing composite model, we will show you a lineage and impact analysis pop-up. This one you might already have seen in the current version of desktop, but that will be extended to also tell you which data sets are dependent on you. So just so you know that, oh, if I publish this, I might break somebody. Now, there's another question that most people have at this point, because you can envision this going on and on and on and on forever in your enterprise, right? People will chain until the end of times. So you end up with endless chains and endless combinations and relationships and dependencies on each other. And that's something we don't want. So for now, we've said the maximum length of a chain is going to be 5 steps. Your enterprise semantic model being step 1. And then in my example, the budget and sales is step 2. Sales and budget Europe would be step 3. So now we have a chain of 3 steps. So we can still add 2. But that's something we just dreamt up. We think 5 might be enough. We don't know. We'll see. That's also why we do the private preview and why we do the public preview in the future, to figure out if this 5 is enough, or maybe it's already too many. Maybe we need to dial it down to 2 or 3. So that's one of the 2 things we're doing. The other thing is we're also going to introduce a flag on a composite model where you can discourage people from chaining. So you will be able to say, let's say you own Sales and Budget Europe, and you don't want anybody else to chain from your model because this is the leading model for sales for Europe. There's nobody really that has the business case to chain on this one. So you can set a flag because you might still be able, you are still able to write your own tool that uses the APIs and work your way around it. So you can still hack it, but we don't think a lot of people will start doing that. There's a question, would you use this feature? Would this feature work only for premium or pro users? The answer is any. So it's not just premium, not just pro, it's just any user. So it's not just a diamond only feature. It's not premium only. This is so useful, we need to have it for more people than just premium. It's good that it can be limited if it needs to be. Exactly, that's what I feel as well. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to talk about is integration with data protection, right? You might have seen this, the Microsoft Information Protection integration that we have. You can go to the service on PowerBI.com and label a data set or a report as being, let's say, highly confidential. And if you do that, that means something because somebody might not be able to download data from a highly confidential data source. They might not be allowed to. And if they try that, they will be blocked. And even if you open that data set in Analyze in Excel, those same rules will still be applied to the Excel file. And that Excel file might not be, for example, printable or might not be exportable to PDF. All of that things, depending on how you configure the policy on these levels, those things might change. You might be able to email it to somebody outside of your organization, for example. Now with the Composite Models feature, where a data set can be dependent on another data set, we need to think about that because what happens if I chain from a data set that is highly confidential? What is my data set then? Am I highly confidential as well? Or should there be something else? So in essence, what we're saying, the highest label prevails. So if I use a highly confidential data set and all of my other data sets that I chain on or depend on are unlabeled, my final data set will be highly confidential. So in a diagram, it would look like this. If I have data model A, which just uses an Excel that is unclassified, that data model A will also be unclassified. If I create a data model B that uses the Excel that is unclassified and connects it with a medium business impact departmental database, my model B will be medium business impact. If I create a model C that uses the enterprise semantic model, which is highly confidential, and the other one is medium, my model C will be highly confidential. And then if I chain from C and B to create D, D will also be highly confidential, right? So the highest label that sits in the combination of data sources that I used will be applied toward the end result. So in that way, there's no way for this to ever go down. The only way it can become more strict. That's the only thing it can do, right? So hopefully that's the right thing for you in your situation as well. Right, so with that, I think we can conclude that life is good again, right? And let's go back to our little story for a sec. Let's think about that. What happens if now I can use those IT sources? I can now connect to those IT sources that I had, which I wasn't able to connect and mesh up with everything that I already had in my Power BI environment. And now suddenly I can. So life is good, right? Well, maybe. We're not done yet, right? I mean, we spoke about the limitations and there's still room for growth. There's still room for improvement, but I think we're getting very close to the happily ever after that we're all looking for. So with that, that is all the slides that I had. And we still have a little bit of time, but yeah, let's open it up for questions, discussion, concerns, rants, as I said, anything.
Amazing. I'm gonna stop the recording, so you feel free to unmute yourselves, guys. Don't be shy.